We are at Job part 3, or can someone please just give us a straight answer? As we work through it, you will discover that how you read Job, the answers you think you get out of Job, very much determine what pieces of the book you think are supposed to be there and what pieces are not. So, with that in mind, I have a recap, and this is a recap that's a combination of our recap from last week plus some of the material from last week. So Job fits into a broad tradition of Israelite Second Temple Jewish wisdom literature. Proverbs is sort of the paradigm. Ecclesiastes says wisdom works, but why bother? And Job says all of this stuff is ridiculous, or would seem to say that. Though Job and Ecclesiastes sound skeptical notes, neither really reject the idea that there is a divine thing that's in charge. They question the efficacy or they question justice, but they don't question the supernatural. Almost all of Job is poetry, uses parallelism. Like Ecclesiastes, it uses natural imagery rather than philosophical discourse. Right? So this abstract philosophical discourse that we're accustomed to in the Greek-influenced Western philosophical tradition, this is not how biblical Hebrew theology, and really even how the rabbis as well, this is not how they will do theology either with philosophical texts. They will use analogies and allegories and things like that. The text of Job is received has defects that suggest copying and transmission errors. So we talked briefly about chunks of chapters being slightly out of order, particularly in the middle of the book. The plot so far, Job is righteous, his children may be a little less so. Yahweh and the adversary is some kind of precursor for what Christianity will call Satan. Wager on whether Job will continue to revere Yahweh if his good life is utterly destroyed. Life is destroyed. Job still doesn't curse Yahweh. Job's friends come to visit. A debate ensues among Job and his 3 friends. Job says, I didn't do anything wrong. This is unjust. They tell him, well, you must have done something wrong. And also, who do you think you are? A 4th interlocutor, Elihu, shows up. We talked about Elihu last time. Argues that Job is getting off easy. Questions how Job can challenge divine justice when clearly you're not up to snuff for being a god. We looked at in some detail how the book of Job, Job's author or authors, we really don't know how many authors there were. There are efforts to figure out sources, but good luck. Job's author or authors use subtle references to biblical texts that we know are around at the time to challenge traditional ideas of divine justice. So we saw how Job's interlocutors, his friends, and Elihu get the Psalms and things that sound like Proverbs and chunks of Deuteronomy sort of put into their mouths to be said uncritically, and then Job turns those texts upside down and says, well, actually, no, these things don't work, right? So one of them is just using the text uncritically, and the other is saying, nope. And Job tends to be the one who twists the text more than the others. But we saw that there's vocabulary used that makes it really clear what Job is talking about, what the book of Job is talking about, without quoting verbatim, which I imagine is one way to stay out of trouble with the priests of the time, is if you don't quote everything verbatim, kind of stay out of trouble. But the vocabulary connections are really in there and kind of undeniable once you look at the Hebrew. So we got all the way to Elihu saying, you don't know what you're talking about. And then is where we left off at the end last week. It wasn't planned to be a cliffhanger, but that's where we ended up. Yahweh appears in the storm, the whirlwind, whatever you want to call it, and tells everybody to shut up because he has something to say. And he starts, so Yahweh has multiple speeches. They start at Job 38, and he comes out of the whirlwind and he says, "Who is this who darkens counsel and words without knowledge? Gird your loins like a man that I may ask you, and you can inform me. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell if you know understanding. Who fixed its measures? Do you know? Or who stretched a line upon it?" So Yahweh basically takes up Elihu's argument. Who do you think you are? Some kind of a god? To say, who do you think you are? Some kind of a god? That you're questioning everything that's been happening. You are an ordinary person. And we get 2 chapters of natural images all asking essentially the same question. What do you know and what can you do? So we get questions like, have you set the stars in the sky? Do you control the weather? Can you teach lions to hunt? Do you cause animals to give birth? Can you tame a wild ox? Do you make the horse strong and useful for men to do battle upon? So these are slightly paraphrased because each of these questions is 4 verses long and you start to get lots and lots of these things. And each time the point is, look at all of the things I have done. How can you possibly be asking whether I am in the right for what's happened to you? Has a second speech that spans chapters 40 and 41. So 38, 39 are all of this. Did you set the stars in motion up in the firmament of the heavens? And did you do all of this? Chapters 40 and 41 are really very specifically about what, for lack of better term, can be Canaanite and ancient Israelite monsters. Very specifically talking about Behemoth and Leviathan. So chapter 40 says, look at Behemoth. I created Behemoth. The power in his loins, the virile strength in his belly's muscles. He is first in the ways of God. Let his maker draw him near with his sword. Can you fight Behemoth? No, of course you can't, but I can. Look at Leviathan. Could you draw Leviathan with a hook and with a cord press down his tongue? Would he urgently entreat you? Would he speak to you gentle words? Would he seal a pact with you that you could take him as a lifelong slave? Again, I could catch Leviathan with a hook. So Leviathan is a sea creature. Behemoth is a land creature. There's an air demon of sorts that we have illustrations of, but we don't have mentioned so much in Job specifically. And in each of these, the point is, well, you couldn't wrestle this thing, but I can. So none of the answers that Yahweh gives coming out of the storm actually answer Job's question at all. The answer to the question, how is this just, is not even, you can't understand my justice, which is what some of Job's friends have been saying. You just can't understand it. It's, you are simply a puny human, stop talking. For really lack of a better way of summarizing it in a sentence. It's, you're a puny human, stop already. So chapter 41, who could be more powerful? The implied answer is, of course, no one. Fire comes from his mouth, smoke from his nostril, his breath lights coals. Gods fear him. And the text really says gods. Elim. Javelins and arrows he ignores. He makes the sea boil. He is king over all the beasts. All of these chapters are just building up superlatives to separate Job from any sense of divine ability. So I have multiple possible pictures of Behemoth and Leviathan. So this is from the Ambrosiana Bible from 1238, right? So one of these illustrated manuscripts. This is Leviathan, this thing that looks like a fish. This is the author's imagining of Behemoth. And this is you're going to say it looks like a griffin, but this is an air creature called Zeev. We don't have Zeev featured terribly prominently in Job, but we've seen these two talked about a lot. Leviathan seems to be, if you dig back far enough in the ancient Near Eastern texts, Leviathan seems to be at least somewhat inspired by crocodiles. Behemoth here is drawn like a cow. It is drawn like a cow in part because behemoth is just the plural of behemah in Hebrew. So behemah in Hebrew is like an animal, like livestock. Behemoth is behemot, just behemah, livestock in the plural, but the idea being some really big thing. So this is one possible representation if you've never seen a hippopotamus before. Yeah, beast. Ami says beast. If you've never seen a hippopotamus before, you don't really know that you're dealing with a hippopotamus. So you draw a cow because behemah, a beast of burden, a cow, right? Or an ox. I don't actually know the difference between a cow and an ox. It's one of those. It has cloven hooves. I don't know whether it chews its own cud. Don't know if this is kosher, but it's a drawing anyway. This is the other possibility for behemoth, with the photo credit to Larry Lawrence. Behemoth seems to be connected to the hippopotamus, that people knew in the ancient Near East about the hippopotamus, and there's stuff in Job that talks about behemoth being in the water. And the strength of his belly muscles and the size of his jaws, and you start to think, maybe that's not a cow. So this is very likely to be where behemoth came from, is the image of a hippopotamus, and then they blew it up to be this supernatural creature because they don't live near hippopotamuses. So these are the things that Job is talking about, or that Yahweh is talking about in the book of Job. Look, I can wrestle a hippopotamus. I can wrestle a crocodile. Could you wrestle a crocodile? Could you use a fishing hook and pull a crocodile out of the ocean? Well, of course you can't, because I'm Yahweh and you're Job. So you can't do that. So this is really the thrust of the response to Job's questioning. There's not even a reveal to Job that, well, I made a bet with the adversary to see if you would curse me, and you didn't. There isn't there was something wrong with the justice that occurred here. There is, in fact, just, well, you're a puny human. The implication maybe is, so you don't understand, but really it's, you're a puny human. Who are you to even call me down to earth to argue with me? Last week we saw a passage where one of Job's friends says something like, not even 1 in 1,000 will get an answer if they call up to the heavens to demand justice. So why do you think you're going to get an answer? Well, Job's answer is, I don't have to answer your questions. In fact, I don't have to come talk to you, but I have. And I have nothing you want to hear. So this is sort of the end of the philosophical argument. Essentially, Yahweh comes down and says, there's no argument to be had. I'm just way more powerful than you. So there's a lot of people with hippo statues I'm seeing in the chat, which is really kind of interesting. My grandmother collected statues of Moses. So if we ever talk about Deuteronomy, I see if I have one of those statues around. There are no ducks in Job. So the end is Job justified by concession? So we could have a Zoom to get the statues together. This is like visiting pets virtually, right? So at the very beginning of chapter 42, 42 is the last chapter, in a 5-verse poem, Job answers by quoting sections of Yahweh's speech, framing them with his own words, and look at the answer. I know you can do anything, and no devising is beyond you. Who is this obscuring counsel without knowledge, right? That was how Yahweh opened his speech. Therefore I told, but did not understand, words beyond me that I did not know. So the answer to who is this obscuring counsel with knowledge, the answer is, well, it was me in my ignorance. By the ear's rumor I heard of you, now my eye has seen you. Therefore do I recant, and I repent in dust and ashes. Not, my analysis of the whole thing was wrong. I really was doing something bad. But instead, you're right, you're more powerful. I just shouldn't have opened my mouth. So I recant, I repent in dust and ashes. And then Job's stuff is restored. And we don't even get a smooth transition. It's, oh, I repent. And then we have Job being restored to his prior wealth. So doesn't altar say that Job doesn't see Yahweh, but here Job says he did see him. So now my eye has seen you, right? We have this verse that says, now my eye has seen you. Well, I mean, it says what it says, right? We do know that the biblical tradition doesn't think you can see Yahweh without dying. So we have this episode in the book of Exodus where Moses says, let me see your face. And Yahweh says, well, look, I can't do that because no man can see my face and die. But, wedge yourself in this rock and I'll allow my presence to pass in front of you. And sometimes it's described as God's back as opposed to his front or his face. And then superlatives, just this flow of superlative words come up. If you go to a traditional Torah service on Shabbat, you will hear those verses recited. They are used in the traditional Torah service. But here it says, my eye has seen you. Presumably, God speaking out of the whirlwind. The whirlwind is maybe how Job sees. This is where there's scholarship that says chapter 42, maybe in its entirety, was added on because it seems a little inconsistent with everything that comes before. However, Job quotes his own book in several places, so this is not a dead giveaway that something was wrong, that this may be quote unquote original. It's in poetry, makes it more likely to be kind of original. All of this other stuff is prose. And it is definitely of a different style, very neatly concludes the story. Job's wealth is doubled. He has new children to replace the ones that he lost. We are actually given the names of his 3 daughters. Cinnamon is one of them. I can't remember the other 2. But his 3 daughters are named, the idea being perhaps their level of beauty exceeded the level of beauty of his prior daughters. He lives to be 140 years old, so he lives longer than Abraham, right? The Torah says Abraham makes it to about 120 and that's it. He makes it past 140 years. He sees his great-grandchildren. Now remember, he's gotten to adulthood. He's lost all of his children, so he's starting over. Some of the outcomes that we see make little sense. So not Job, but Yahweh says to Eliphaz, who is the ringleader of the three friends, my wrath has flared against you and your two companions because you have not spoken right of me, as did my servant Job. And they are instructed to make a sacrifice. Job is to serve as the priest. And somehow Job is right, because the implication of Eliphaz and the other two being wrong is that Job was right. The problem, of course, is that the Yahweh speaking from the whirlwind that we saw largely agrees with what his friends had to say. Because part of his friend's argument was, you simply aren't powerful enough to understand any of this stuff. Who do you think you are? Which is the substance of 4 chapters of Yahweh's speech at the end of the book of Job. So is Job right? Is Eliphaz, who's right here? It seems like Job is right, because Yahweh has said, you have not spoken right of me, as did my servant Job. So the outcome here is kind of confusing. Elihu, who got 5 chapters, 4 different speeches, shows up and says to all of Job's friends, I can't believe you haven't managed to convict this guy yet. Here, let me do it. And then proceeds to make all the same arguments that his friends did. Elihu is never mentioned again. So Elihu gets 5 chapters, disappears. So was he added in later? We don't really know. But we're left with this really funny, unusual, inconsistent ending to this book. So the question is, who's right? Is Job right? Or his friends right? Is Elihu right? Is no one right? If you take the prologue and the epilogue as being original to the book, somehow Job is. Or if you read the book as a whole, somehow Job is right. He demands a hearing, he gets it, and he's restored mostly. But so are his friends and Elihu, because Job does receive his just deserts, right? They've been saying the whole time, if you're a good person, you'll be restored. Clearly, you're not a good person. This is why you're being punished. But Job is restored. So who's wrong and about what? If you take the epilogue away, pull away everything after Job's poem where he concedes ignorance, and somehow Job is right again, because he's saying none of this is borne out by divine justice or what I've been told is supposed to happen. And look, God appears from the whirlwind and says, yeah, you're right. I just do what I want. Not even, and you couldn't understand. That's not there. All that's really there is, I do what I want, and you're just not as powerful as me. So that bears out Job saying, this stuff is random. What just happened here? Why am I suffering? He doesn't get an answer. His critique is right. And no word of what the adversary thought. No. So Norm asks, what about the adversary? And the answer is, doesn't come up again. We're done with the adversary in chapter 2 or chapter 3. Doesn't come back up. So the prologue and the epilogue don't seem to connect up necessarily. And the epilogue doesn't seem to connect up with lots of what came before. So somebody read this and needed an outcome and wanted a clean ending to the book and put it in. That's the modern biblical scholarly hypothesis, is somebody wanted a clean ending, so they made one, which isn't all that unusual. But that somebody wanted a clean ending part also sort of means that the narrative we had at the beginning with the stuff that happens to Job might be original to the book. So Ami says, like a Hollywood happy ending, right? It's all wrapped up. We don't really know how we got from point A to point B. A bad Hollywood happy ending, right? You can't trace it through. But somehow, no matter which version of this book you read, how you view what you do with the epilogue, Job is right. Akiva asks, why did they canonize this book? They did. There doesn't even seem to be a debate about canonizing this book. So why is this book in the Tanakh? There's no question about it, or there's no specific discussion of it, right? So there's a little bit of specific discussion about the book of Esther in the Talmud, but a number of the books, Job is among them, but also the book of Ezekiel and several others, are mentioned as having been edited or redacted or something by a set of rabbis, including one, it's, I can't remember the name of the rabbi, but the characterization of it is basically, these were the decisions of the sages in the upper room of, and this particular rabbi. So there was some kind of meeting that, at least there's a traditional notion that there was a meeting, a committee of rabbis who got together in someone's attic or the upper room of his house and figured out how to interpret these books to make them canonical. Job, because Job has all kinds of problems theologically, if you look at it closely, the book of Ezekiel, which is a prophetic book and seems like it should be a shoo-in, is actually its own problem, because the book of Ezekiel has priestly laws in it that contradict Leviticus. So they had to figure out how to interpret this book in order to make it work within canon. So there is this memory, we don't know the level of truth of it, there is this memory that there was a canonization process in somebody's attic. We do also know that scraps of Job were at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this for sure means that Job was accepted by a really fringe Jewish group 150 years, 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. So it's also possible that the rabbis just inherited a book like this and were stuck with it, and then had to find a way to make it work. Some of the ways they found to make it work are that you will occasionally find quotes from Job, 2 or 3 words in a shot, in the Siddur, in relatively old parts of the Siddur. So traditional prayer books will have little chunks of Job, just like they have little chunks of Psalms and prophets strung together, and that's what a lot of the prayers are composed of. There are every so often, there's a little bit of Job that you'll find in there. So they did what they did with a lot of other books, is they made it acceptable by pulling pieces out and reinterpreting them. Past that, we don't have a lot of insight into why they canonized Job. They may have just been stuck with it. They may have figured out how to interpret it. But you also have to keep in mind that they think the epilogue is part of the book, right? So this neat ending that, from the perspective of biblical scholarship, we're saying maybe that's not supposed to be there, or somebody added it on. That's the version of the book they have. And they don't think that it doesn't belong there. So they're willing to accept the ending as proving whatever the theological point was supposed to be. And keeping that piece of it in mind, that from an Orthodox perspective, this weird epilogue belongs with the book, is going to be important in a few minutes. Okay, so before we start talking about the ancient Near East, do we have questions, things I didn't address? Oh, Nadine says, these don't seem like friends. Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Yes, I will let you back in.
Thank you.
Um,
I'm not sure I can exit even. But... Okay.
So the word friends And Nadine says, these don't seem like friends. Is there another translation? And how would they have had contact with crocodiles? Okay, so these don't seem like friends. You could translate it as comrades or fellows or something like that. So that's one possible interpretation of the word friends. Neighbors, right? Because it's this word re'ah, which means friend or neighbor or whatever. There's a lot of possible meanings. Biblical Hebrew doesn't have a huge vocabulary. So you end up using words in strange ways. What did I just do here? So yeah, they're not necessarily friends, but we don't have it's just as good a translation as any. And how would they have had contact with crocodiles? So we do know that at least by 500 BCE, there is a Jewish settlement in Egypt in a city called Elephantine. So there are Judeans or Jews or Israelites or whatever they are at this point in time who are living in Egypt, which is where crocodiles are, right? Crocodiles are in the Nile River, among other places. So these people live in Egypt. They appear to be mercenaries. They have built a little temple of their own, and they are in correspondence with the temple in Jerusalem. So there are some folks who are literate in that community. So they have either had word of crocodiles, or they've gotten a description of crocodiles and hippopotamuses, and that's how they know what there is. And this is a narrow group of people who would have written or read this thing. So they're all people who are literate. They're more likely to be people who have traveled and had exposure to other creatures and to trade routes and to whatever else. So they could have had some contact with crocodiles or known something about them, because they can read and they are intellectuals to the extent there are intellectuals in ancient Israel. So that's how they would know.
Jeremy?
Yes, David.
Isn't it
Thank you.
thought that the prologue and the epilogue are the parts that come from Persian sources rather than Hebrew sources?
So maybe the problem is there's not any Persian vocabulary. So when we were looking at Ecclesiastes, one of the things that we noticed were there were some Persian words that have since become part of modern Hebrew vocabulary, but are new. And there isn't any of that in Job. So it makes it a little harder to kind of say, oh, there's definitely a Persian source there. It is possible that the adversary concept has traveled over.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because the Persians have a much more binary view of the world and the universe than the Israelites did. So it's possible that they grabbed that concept, or that concept had worked its way into Israelite thought.
Yeah.
At some point.
Avesta or whatever.
Yeah. But the monsters are Canaanite monsters.
Jeremy, just in an anecdote, again, Leviathan, which in Hebrew is Leviathan, has been interpreted in contemporary Hebrew as a whale.
Yeah. But then what Jonah was in is not a whale then.
Oh.
I mean, so to be fair, so Jonah is depicted as having been swallowed by a whale, but actually it just says big fish in the Hebrew for Jonah. So it's possible that Leviathan is a whale. In some respect, it's a sea monster.
That's how it came out, eventually interpreted in contemporary Hebrew. That's the word in Hebrew for whale.
But it's a sea monster, or a dragon or something. So Jack, you had...
Yeah, just to, sort of in terms of the theology of the thing, if you take away the epilogue, doesn't it make a kind of coherence that is it's not for puny humans to attempt to assign puny human moral and ethical standards to the inexplicable divine. And the role of puny humans is to be pious and follow the ground rules and be pious, and that's it. Isn't that how it seems to end if you take out the epilogue?
So maybe, I think that's the best answer, because it never actually says just follow the rules. Right? Job's friends say follow the rules and you won't suffer. But that's not what is said when Yahweh appears out of the whirlwind.
No, Yahweh,
Yahweh never says, he never says follow my instructions. He just says, what do you think you're doing?
No, I understand. I mean, Yahweh in the whirlwind is like that great line from Ring Lardner, shut up, he explained. So that's what Yahweh does. But where does that leave humans? Job gets something, right? He gets the theophany. He gets God to show up. God answers his summons, and then says, puny person. So he doesn't give an answer on the merits. So you can't get an answer in this view. You don't get an answer on the merits. What's left to you? Well, what's left to you is submission. It's an Islamic text. All that's left to you is to submit to the greater power. And what does submission mean? Well, submission means demonstrate your submission through piety.
Yeah.
So that works. That works theologically. There is the additional problem of, but why?
Well, wasn't that at a more basic level, like keep believing in me and you get all your stuff restored to you? I mean.
So
but I wanted to take the epilogue out.
Right.
I wanted to try and figure out some way of making sense of the thing without the Hollywood ending.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, so I think the sense that you make out of it is a little, it's a little Rashomon-esque, right? Which lens are you going to look at this thing through? That gives you a different answer, right? So Job is both right and wrong in every single possible outcome. He recognizes that there's been an injustice done. But because there's been an injustice done, it sort of tells you that even if you submit, there's no guarantee that anything will happen that you expect to have happen. Right? We know Job is unjustly punished.
Right. And that's
in the context of the story.
Sure. And so that's the fate of humans. You're stuck in a world of potential chaos and precarity and lack of justice. And so from that point of view, the best you can do is be pious, submit to the will of God.
And cross your fingers.
Yep.
Yeah.
But then he does get awarded. Once he submits, he's being awarded. So what I read in here is that, you can have all your arguments you want. Justice is not the issue. Maybe just that God felt like having a bath and he enjoyed it. And so that's his prerogative. But all those arguments about justice are pointless. Just repent and submit, and you'll be rewarded. That's exactly what happened. After he submits, he's being rewarded.
Yeah, except Jack was looking at it without the epilogue that was stuck on where he got all his stuff back. So at that point, he wasn't really rewarded before then, right?
Right.
So I've always read this exactly the opposite. This strikes me as a deeply subversive book. Some of his interlocutors say, "Who are you? You don't understand anything." But we as the readers understand perfectly that this is a bet. He's being treated like a bug, and Satan and God are like having a bet if he's going to go to the right or the left, and that the message of the book seems to be, there is no justice. There's not a grand plan. Good people do suffer. Bad people will sometimes be victorious. And so my take on this has always been, and I don't know if this is right or not at all, that this was the people who canonized the whole thing decided they need to have something in there that suggests they're just not simple-minded fools. So they put some subversive book in with the whole thing so that people who are deep and think they're sophisticated can also find something in there. But as a soporific to everybody else, they throw on this epilogue just to get it to pass muster.
So you're a Leo Strauss guy.
I don't know. I don't know. This is just what I've come up with, but I don't know who else has said it or whether it's completely contradicted by all the evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeremy.
Uh-huh.
I think I mentioned to you, I read Yaakov Malkin's book, Epicurus Apikuros, and he claims that the book has the sensibility that the book of Job has the sensibility of the philosophy of Epicurus, and that it's not because the gods argue that the Trojan War ensues. It just happens. That's myth. Epicurus, believed in the atomic theory from Democritus, and that's just the way the world is, and it has nothing to do with the gods. That's just the way things are.
Yeah. So the person David is talking about, Yaakov Malkin, for those who haven't heard his name or it's been a while, Yaakov Malkin is the Sherwin wine of Israel, which is to say he founded the institutions in Israel that are the sister institutions to the Society for Humanistic Judaism and the Rabbinical School and all of that stuff in Israel. His daughter is presently the dean and runs that chunk of humanistic Judaism in Israel.
Yeah, we met her on the tour.
Yeah. So this is Sivan's father, who wrote a book called Epicurus and Apicorsim. And what Professor Malkin was talking about, I think if you pull off the narrative, is probably about right. But it's hard to decouple the narrative and make the book be a unified book.
Yeah.
So you're left with that question.
Yeah.
But we've actually looked at a text a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at Ecclesiastes. We've looked at a text that is very much like Job. So we looked at a text called the Babylonian Theodicy, which we know from Akkadian, there are a few tablets of it hanging around. So it's fragmentary, like almost everything is from that period. Clay tablets don't necessarily survive very long. This is stuff that's written in the little wedges of cuneiform. So we have, the first line is the person suffering. The second line is his friend. So I've looked around society. The evidence is contrary. The god does not impede the way of a devil. A father drags his boat along the canal while his firstborn lies in bed, right? Look at all of these injustices. And his friend responds with things like, what you say is gloomy. You let your mind dwell on evil. You make your fine discretion like an imbecile's. You've reduced your beaming face to scowls. You're just harshing my buzz, man. Right? I mean, that's like that's the answer is, well, this is depressing. But the arguments in Job are also in the Babylonian Theodicy. And the Babylonian Theodicy is considerably older. So Job, if you put it at like the 5th century, the Babylonian Theodicy is from about the 11th century. And it's written in Akkadian that's trying to be even older. So Akkadian survived as a language for about 2,500 years. And there are styles of Akkadian that are sort of neoclassical, and it's written in this neoclassical style that tells you, oh, it was written 1,000 years before the Common Era, but it was trying to pretend it was written 2,000 years before the Common Era. No one needs to know as much about Akkadian as I just told you. This is older. This is older. We have another Akkadian poem, I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom, poem of the righteous sufferer. Again, Akkadian, late 2nd millennium. My God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. My strength is gone. My appearance has become gloomy. My dignity has flown away. My protection made off. The omen organs are confused and inflamed for me every day. My hunger is prolonged. My throat stopped up. When grain is served, I eat it like stinkweed. Beer, the life of mankind is distasteful to me. So this is Akkadian. What wine was for Israelites, beer was for a lot of other people in the ancient Near East. Wheat's a tougher grow in Israel, the land of Israel at the time. So, and grapes grow better. So wine became the alcoholic beverage of choice as opposed to beer. And beer had a lot of carbs and, could be consumed as a meal. I can't imagine it was like the very refined beer we have today. It may have been, people joke about stouts like Guinness as being a loaf of bread in a glass. This was a loaf of bread in a glass. So a lot of this could be like Job, could be like Psalms. So last time I said, we make these kind of distinctions in biblical literature between narrative and poetry and wisdom literature, and the distinction is not all that clean. We saw Job use Psalms a lot. This is written like the Psalms that talk about having been forsaken. So this is written in a very similar way. The omen organs are confused and inflamed for me every day. Remember, these are pagans. They open up animals and look at the organs on the animals to try to figure out what's happening in the world. So omen organs, they mean this literally. They don't mean to say, well, my appendix feels a little swollen today. So, they're opening up animals and checking them out. So common themes with Job, other wisdom literature, that they're connected, right? These texts are really very similar and tied together in a lot of ways, that if you only looked at this thing by looking at it in the biblical text, you would never pick this up. You kind of have to read outside to figure out that what's happening in Job and a lot of biblical literature is like what's happening in other cultures at the time too, and seems to sometimes be copying what was in those other cultures. And we've seen Behemoth and Leviathan, so we've talked about them. We have not talked about Mount Zaphon, Rahab, and Yam, and their Babylonian parallels Marduk and Tiamat, all of whom are mentioned in chapter 26. So chapter 26 is one of Job's friends giving him a hard time again. And Mount Zaphon is the Canaanite Mount Olympus. So Jerusalem is the home of the gods on this Mount Olympus, Mount Zaphon. Rahab and Yam are sea deities, who are equivalent to Marduk and Tiamat in Babylonian mythology, right? So we have this common language about gods and goddesses. A great sea serpent, Leviathan, right? This is how we know serpent as opposed to whale. Shall slay the dragon that is the sea. So all of this stuff, a purportedly monotheistic text takes for granted that Rahab and Yam, who correspond to Babylonian deities, are things that can be conquered and have been conquered. So the strict monotheism that we are told is in the text is not in the text. That Yahweh happens to be the chief of the gods here, not the only one. So we're very tied into ancient Near Eastern mythology, Canaanite mythology, Babylonian mythology. There's a lot of commonalities in these pieces of literature, and they're all here in Job. So not only does Job assume that there is divine, Job assumes a whole pantheon of things that you'll at least know by reference through folklore. So Larry emailed me last week and said, how is Job used, is Job used, and how is Job used in modern Orthodox theology or in Orthodox Jewish thought talking about the Holocaust? And the most exemplary use of Job is by a modern Orthodox theologian, and Job seems like a perfect model if you're questioning the existence of God after Auschwitz, right? All of these horrible things happen. How could this possibly, you can't say there's divine justice given all of this. And Job is actually not the example that is most often used in Holocaust theology when you're talking about this stuff. So if you keep in mind that modern Orthodox scholars think that all of Job is supposed to be there in his original, you don't have the nihilistic kind of conclusion that we tend to reach when you pull out the epilogue. So if you assume that's all supposed to be there, and we have the problem of is Job right or wrong, and then you have to ask, okay, so if Job is a model, what kind? Does Job enable radical skepticism and rejection of traditional thought? Does Job reaffirm and provide a model for getting the right answer, right? Whether the epilogue is supposed to be there has something to do with your answer to these questions. So ELIEZER BERKOVITS is an Orthodox rabbi who lived in the US most of his adult life. So he has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin, served as a rabbi in Berlin for a few years, escaped World War II just before it started, came to the US, was a rabbi in Chicago for a long time, wrote a book called Faith After the Holocaust, quite literally during the Six-Day War. So he was reading the news and starting to get concerned about Israel a couple of weeks before the Six-Day War, and he really finished the book basically as the last shots were fired. And he talks about this in his introduction to the book. I was very concerned, and this came out of this Six-Day War period when I was really worried. And he does a couple of interesting things. One is he says, you need to ask the question, where was God? You're actually not doing Judaism right from his perspective if you don't ask the question. The flip side to it is you're doing it wrong if you reject God. And his argument is, it's not that we're Job. The only Jobs are the people who actually went through the concentration camps. We are not Job, we are Job's brother. And because we're Job's brother, we look at Job, and there are millions of Jobs from his perspective, and we are not free to reject God. This is his argument. We're not free to reject God because while there were Jobs who did reject God, that's their special privilege from having lived through what they lived through. Other Jobs did not reject God. So you are not free to reject God. You are, however, obliged to ask questions. And his position on this is, it's obscene for you to either have a completely unquestioning faith, because then it means you're not actually looking at history and taking it seriously, and taking the history of the Jewish people seriously. And if you reject God, that's obscene too, because you're also not looking at history. What you're doing is using the Holocaust as a justification for what you already think. And this rejection of God argument is actually the inverse of how Sherwin-Wine has talked about the Holocaust. So Sherwin has at one point said, you don't need the Holocaust to reach the conclusion that there's no God controlling everything. It doesn't disprove it, but you could look at the Inquisition, you could look at the Crusades. There are any number of episodes of human suffering that tell you what you need to know. You really don't need the Holocaust to make that point. It's just another example. It's a worse example, but it's just another example. Berkovits is saying essentially the same thing. You don't need to reject the Holocaust. You don't need the Holocaust to get you to that conclusion. Maybe you're just abusing the Holocaust as an example to prove your point. So he has this very specific way of understanding what Job is about. And in doing that, what he does is he actually limits the power of the book of Job as a thing for us to use. Because he's saying, you're not Job. I am not Job. He says, I did not live through the camps. I am not Job. I am Job's brother. You are Job's brother. The only Jobs are the people who went through this. And some of those Jobs continued to believe, believed even more, voluntarily went to their deaths affirming the unity of a one God. And so you are not free to reject, but you're not free not to question. And he talks about the idea of God having hidden God's face, which is an idea that exists in biblical texts, and says God hid God's face to ensure free will. We are totally back into the circular, traditional, philosophical, theological, philosophy or religion arguments about theodicy. If you don't accept Berkovitz's premises, you're not persuaded by where he goes. So I saw as I was talking about this that there were people going, what? If you're not convinced by his premises, because he makes among his arguments is there's a logical fallacy called special pleading, where you say, yeah, but see, this is different. And he makes special pleading arguments of the type that were used 1,200 years ago to say that the Torah is true, the prophets are true. We know that Israel had this experience in the desert, and therefore the biblical text is true. And that's how I can get away with saying all of this stuff. So he doesn't accept modern biblical criticism for sure. And that's how he manages to make his case. If you agree with all of the stuff that he's relying on, you can be persuaded. If you don't, you can't be persuaded by this. And his idea is this hidden face of God thing is, of course, the opposite of Job, because in Job, God shows his face at the end and has nothing to say that Job actually wants to hear. Here, he's saying, well, God's face has to be hidden because if God intervenes in history, Jews were not free to fully accept God when they became martyrs, and the Nazis weren't completely free to put Jews in that position. So God hid God's face. This all makes God very upset, but oh well. it doesn't work if you start to kind of pick it apart unless you accept his premises. But it shows what he does with Job, which is to say, actually, Job is beside the point. All of these arguments that are in Job, these are not for you to have. You can question, but you're not Job. So this was kind of inspired by Larry's, so what happens with Job in Orthodox theology? And the answer is this, that this is one of the kind of standard approaches that gets used in the modern Orthodox world to explain the Holocaust. Because you have to maintain belief as well that Scripture is divinely inspired and this all has a purpose and whatever else. And so Job doesn't work for you very well, and so Job is steered around. So again, specifically because Berkovits accepts the ending of the book as genuine, and that affects the book's answers. And then he gets to kind of take us out of Job and say, but that's not us anyway. There is a plan. So that's, it says, end of slideshow. Those are all the slides. I have no more slides about Job. But I can answer questions and whatever else you might have.
I just wanted to say, when you were talking about justification for the Holocaust, that there was a rabbi a few years ago who engendered a lot of controversy by saying, look, you have to take this to its logical conclusion. We Jews must have done something awful to deserve this. Otherwise, God isn't just.
That argument gets made a lot in Haredi circles in particular. So ultra-Orthodox circles, that argument comes up. That argument suffers from the weakness of, why all the Haredi Jews? Because those are the ones who died in the largest numbers. Were the ones that this person would say were pious.
Right.
So that argument, you again, another one where you kind of pick it apart and go, well, wait a second, that doesn't really make sense, does it?
Right. Well, yeah, but not to us anyway.
So I have a question. Okay.
Yes.
So this is my first exposure to Job, and because I know you've done excerpts, and I know everybody else, or not everybody, but a lot of you are much more well-read in this area than I am. But from your presentation, it just seems to me that, and I wonder if this is not the case, that the message is, no matter what you say or what you do or what any of your friends say or do, God is all powerful, could be, whatever his mood is, and, he can take one day and give the other day, and that there's no real logical message. And so, you can try, but just the message is God is all powerful, period, no matter what, and can do whatever he wants, whenever, however.
Yeah, I don't think that's a misreading. I mean, it really, there are different nuances of it, right? So Akiva had a particular nuance, and right, but that's there. That's sitting right there. Is the actually, it's all terrible, and that's a completely logical conclusion to get to, because that's really what's there. I kind of wanted to spare us 20 chapters of Job's friends arguing back and forth. But I picked representative stuff for what they had to say. At a certain point, they become very repetitive. But yeah, what you're seeing is what's there.
Okay. So I don't have to read all the rest of it.
Not really, no.
No, but it's interesting for thinking about. But.
Akiva.
I have a question about this dispute about whether the epilogue is real or something. Even when I was raised Orthodox, I don't think anybody reads this story as, there's arguments about whether or not the 7 days of creation are literally true, but nobody takes this story with the devil making a bet with God as true in that sense, to always take it as a myth or a legend or a parable or something. So what does it mean to argue about whether the epilogue is something? What is that argument about if you assume that it's not supposed to be a true event?
If you assume it's not supposed to be a true event, it becomes.
If you assume it really wasn't the devil making a bet with God, but it's a parable, which is how even when I was, raised Orthodox, I don't know, it never would have occurred to me to read it as that's supposed to be as true as the story of Moses going up Mount Sinai, which is not supposed to be a parable.
Yeah. So if you want to interpret it as a parable or as figuratively, you still have the issue of working around that the ending does change how you read the whole thing. So what's the message you're supposed to take away? The message you're supposed to take away is not all of this is pointless, which if you lop the epilogue off, that is the message you get. I mean, you're not supposed to think it's pointless in an Orthodox environment, but you're not supposed to think it's as cut and dried as the really simple version of Deuteronomy as you sometimes get it. So if you think the epilogue isn't genuine, you lop it off, you've got a different book. You have a nihilistic book. I mean, at one point in the PowerPoint slides, I said, Proverbs assumes that all of this stuff is basically works. Ecclesiastes says it works, and Job is kind of the nihilist of the bunch who says this is all lies. Once you chop the epilogue off, that's the book you get. Keep the epilogue on, and you've got a different message.
It's still God's word. It's God trying to convey an idea. It's important, whether it's historical or not. It's still trying. You still have to try to understand what message is supposed to be coming through.
I mean, I will say in writing the PowerPoint slides, I had a devil of a time keeping my head straight every time I put the epilogue in or pulled the epilogue out. Because it was, well, what's the message? Wait. Okay, am I thinking about this with or without the epilogue, and what does that mean for how I'm presenting this? So it really does color the reading, kind of unavoidably. I'm still confused.
Yeah, I still think it's kind of some kind of attempt to. I'll say there's two different, the contemporary description by Orthodox people of God seems to be something grafted on from Greek philosophy. I don't know if it's by Maimonides or whoever, this notion that God is all just and all powerful and all good. That does not, if you just read, the Torah, that's not the character you've come up with. You've come up with this much more complicated character who makes mistakes and is angry at people for not doing what he thought they were going to do, and so on. But this is always read to me like an acknowledgement that, contrary to what it says in other places, the good are not, it's the opposite of the prosperity gospel. It says, you who think the prosperity gospel is true because you only read that other book, no, it's more complicated. And as such, it's a way of keeping people in who suffered extreme suffering. I mean, if you just have the prosperity gospel and then you have the Holocaust or the coronavirus or whatever, you say, well, I guess that was wrong. This says, no, it's all complicated because you didn't read the last book.
Yeah, I mean, and Ecclesiastes kind of has some of the same points. So, I mean, there's a line of thought that thinks, already people had figured out that the theology was not going to work as announced in Deuteronomy or whatever it is. And so we have these other books. And some people think, okay, the rabbis just couldn't avoid including them. And other people think, no, the rabbis included them not just as an avoidance thing, but because this was part of Jewish theology already. And so there's another piece to this from modern scholarship's perspective, which is the book of Daniel is very late. So the traditional understanding of the book of Daniel is that Daniel is written during the Babylonian exile. If you piece apart the apocalyptic sections of the book of Daniel, you find that you can date Daniel within a 2-year period. And it's 164 or 163 BCE. So it's in the middle of the Maccabean revolt. Like, we know exactly when things went wrong for Daniel's prophecies. And Daniel kind of defers all of this stuff to an afterlife. It's the first book in the Tanakh that seems to suggest there's actually reward and punishment afterward, as opposed to, even Job talks about Sheol, right? You just kind of go into this gloomy nothingness, like, you know, the Greek underworld is very similar, right? This is shadowy afterlife kind of thing. So that's the last piece that you need conceptually to kind of get to where the rabbis are, which is there's a world to come. Things are bad in this world. There's a world to come and things will be okay. And once you have that piece, Job and Ecclesiastes are a lot easier to stomach when you're putting together a canon, because you know they're pointing out something legitimate about the world and there's a way of dealing with it, which is kicking the can down the road, essentially, which is what the book of Daniel does.
And I take it, Jeremy, that that's the use of the book of Job in Christian theology?
Yeah. Christians actually tend to read it more than Jews. This is true of the prophetic literature and the stuff in the writings as well. So this is part of the Ch section. There's Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. This is the Ketuvim section. We don't read this stuff. Like, we hardly read this stuff in public Jewish spaces. Job is hardly ever read in public Jewish spaces. If you go to a traditional synagogue and you look at what the Haftarah is almost always from the prophets and nowhere else. Job doesn't get a good reading, nor does a lot of the rest of the books of Chronicles. People don't read that. So we don't look at it very much. Christians do. There's a whole chunk of, so this even extends to modern biblical scholarship. It is hard to find Jewish scholars working in the modern academy who study things other than the Torah and the book of Ruth, the book of Esther, the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, right? The stuff that really appears constantly in Jewish literature. There are not a lot of Jewish biblical scholars doing, you know, the books of Chronicles or even some of the other prophetic books. We don't read that stuff. Christians do. So Job would appear in the lectionary sometimes. No, you're never going to read this in a synagogue on a Saturday morning. It's just not going to happen.
And are you attributing that to their greater emphasis on the afterlife? Is that what you're...
So in part, it's a greater emphasis on the afterlife, but in part, it's what you think Scripture is doing in your tradition. So in Christian tradition, some of the job of Scripture is to reaffirm the view of the Messiah. So if that's your lens through which you read everything, you get a lot more literature to pick from. Whereas for Judaism, you know, traditional Judaism very much focuses on the Torah and on what the rules are, and the prophets are there to point out what happens when you break the rules. Yeah, Larry.
Question. So
One of the many things I don't understand, and I've thought about this a lot, and I know there's a lot of scholarship that exists that may enlighten me, but I've always thought about the process of compiling the Tanakh, and it was a long process. It wasn't a bunch of people in a room one day. I understand it was give and take and compromise and all of that, but I've always thought that someone somewhere wanted it all to be believed, as millions of people did believe it later, literally word for word. And I not understood how a person could say, believe the first 7 verses of Genesis and then the ones that contradict them and all the rest of the illogic. I just don't understand it.
So one of the books that I read a few years ago, and I guess I should give the full disclosure that the author of the book was one of my professors when I was a doctoral student. I will give the other piece of it that I would not have rated as one of his best students. So take that for what you will. Has actually said, you know, this was a slow process. Not just a slow process of compiling the books, but a slow process upward to the kind of authority that the Bible eventually got. So his book is actually called How the Bible Became Holy. And he kind of says, you know, initially, some of this stuff may not have been much more different than scribal exercises. People wrote the stuff, they stuck it in the temple's warehouse. People discovered it later. Seems to be how Deuteronomy in its initial version may have been discovered or put together. And then over time, it goes from having literary authority, think Shakespeare. It goes from having literary authority to a little bit more binding authority and a little bit more binding authority and a little bit more binding authority. And it really isn't, he thinks, until the 1st century CE that people are really saying these texts are directly divinely inspired. He thinks it takes quite a while to get there, a period of 5 centuries almost. So how did we get from point A to point B? A slow process, and he identifies it functioning differently in Christianity and in Judaism. Because we know, when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a bunch of other stuff in there. And a lot of the other stuff, no one else ever uses. And it seems to have been how they may have governed some of their society. So does that mean that it was more important than the biblical text to them? Maybe. So that means something about what the biblical text meant to them. How authoritative was it? So even 2 centuries before the Common Era, things seem to still be up for grabs. So it's just this process of things becoming more ingrained and more authoritative, as opposed to there was a sudden moment where here's this book, accept this book. Not least of which is because they don't have books, right? This format of a book that we use, the codex, is not the format that the rabbis had or that early Christians had, right? We don't see codices like this until the 4th century. Everybody else is using scrolls, so nobody has a thing in which the whole thing is bound together. Just a bunch of scrolls.
But people memorized the whole text. Later they did anyway, and I assume there were some people who knew everything that was written down at some point and knew the stuff, and they said, "Oh, we'll leave this out," and so they knew that too.
Well, I think the people who were making the decisions didn't necessarily have it all memorized.
They may not have, but some people must have, because later people did. It's something you can do.
Right. There is a thrust pretty early on to getting the stuff down in writing and not changing it.
Right. And are you suggesting you agree with your professor who didn't think you were an A student, but you agree with
I
the
mean, I
thesis
can
enough to suggest it to us?
I can empirically prove I wasn't an A student. I can empirically prove that I failed his class. I didn't finish a term paper. So I basically, my dad was having health problems. I said, I can't keep doing this. And I never got around to finishing the term paper. The incomplete turned to an F. But that would not have qualified me as one of his better students. I don't know that I'm persuaded that his exact version of it is correct, but it seems more humanly possible than, oh, we have the book. Everybody just believes that the book is right. Particularly because so many people weren't literate. It's hard to see them saying, oh, well, that thing I can't read. Clearly, you are correct. That book is right. So I think he has a point.
So referring back to Yaakov Malkin,
Mhm.
he seems to say that the book of Job is very consistent, sort of fits into, SHJ thinking. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's a book for secular humanistic Judaism, so to speak?
I think it is like an awful lot of philosophy. Philosophy is at its best when the question it's asking is, how do you know that? Science keeps showing that philosophers don't actually know how the universe works, right? That used to be the job of philosophers, to tell you how the planets moved and all that other stuff. Philosophy is at its best when it's asking, how do you know that question?
Ready to have a talk?
Just finished my
Right.
book.
You finished which book?
It's
So-
Other Mystery, the Swedish Mystery.
Oh,
Oh, it's still going?
yeah.
Oh.
So Socrates was always a pain in the butt because his question was always, how do you know that? You don't really know that. Job is great as a, how do you know that book? If the proposition is there is divine justice, Job is a great book for pushing back on that question, which makes it a great humanistic Jewish book because it asks the questions that we're already asking. The arguments Job makes are no different from the arguments that will be made 1700 years later when Aquinas is trying to prove the existence of God. The argument never changes. The terms change, but the argument itself doesn't change, right? Job uses naturalistic language and specific examples and all kinds of other things that aren't the language of Greek philosophy, which is the language of Socrates, right? The language of modern humanistic Judaism is also pretty Greek philosophy, right? Sherwin Wine almost got a PhD in philosophy. There's a way he argued stuff. There's a way we argue stuff. We don't tend to argue it like we're in the book of Job, but Job's arguments are the same ones we make. How can you say there's divine justice? Look at what happened. So to that extent, yeah, I think he's right. It's a good book for us to look at. It's part of why I said, hey, we should really look at Ecclesiastes and Job because these are really forerunner texts. But I think you do have to put the pin into them that they do accept their time's view of how the universe was put together. That, they're sea monsters. Job takes for granted that there are sea monsters. We do not take for granted that there are sea monsters or giant hippopotamuses or, whatever. But Job clearly does. And Ecclesiastes clearly does. So that part of it is a thing that doesn't necessarily work for humanistic Jews, but the questions are the questions. And the answers are some of the same answers. And there are an awful lot of people in the world of humanistic Judaism who ask those questions, give those answers, and still hold on to the idea that there's something binding this all together. So if you live in the Facebook Humanistic Judaism discussion group, this is where you see people say, well, maybe I'm a pantheist or I'm a panentheist, or Spinoza seems pretty attractive to me, right? Because there's still I want to grasp onto some kind of supernatural thing that binds us all together, even if I don't necessarily think that's all true. So that doesn't necessarily make Job terribly inconsistent either, except that thing that binds everything together doesn't have a lot of conscious thought to it for most people. But yeah, I think it otherwise probably kind of works for a lot of people. And if only the Hebrew weren't such a pain in the butt, it'd be.
Well,
I had
James
professors.
version it sounds so much better to me than Alter's. I mean, the poetry part of it.
Oh yeah, yeah. So Alter is trying to do something interesting. I kind of like his translation for some of its language is really. He has a good fix on like how material the world of Job would have been. So I've edited, I removed some of the text from some of the verses, but some of those verses are way more evocative and less tap dancey around what's actually there than is in the King James version or the old JPS version or something like that.
A little question on that, if I could. I think Alter says, well, Yahweh spoke out of a cloud. It doesn't say whirlwind, it says cloud, but the word whirlwind is so evocative, I just got to keep that one. And my question is, does anyone know where the King James Version folks got the word whirlwind, since they understood Hebrew very well?
So it uses the word cloud, but it doesn't use the word cloud, which is to say, it uses a different word for cloud.
I think he says that, yeah.
So if you're thinking of cloud, the cloud image that a lot of people have is the pillar of cloud that leads the Israelites through the desert. That's not the word he uses. That's not the word Job uses. It uses a different word. It uses the word sha'ar. It's not the same thing. So
yeah, he says it means simply storm.
Right.
Is what Alter says. It seems so deeply embedded in the imagination of speakers of English after the King James Version that it seems wise not to tamper with it.
Yeah. And even, so this is the Job translation by Edward Greenstein, who is a Semitic scholar, and he kind of knows better too, and he uses the word windstorm. So he's keeping it too because it is so evocative. And he doesn't even footnote it. Like, he doesn't even bother to tell you that that's what he's done. He just goes with it. And he kind of points out, this is Yahweh, so he's taking on the evil persona of the windstorm, and we know that Yahweh is a storm god. This makes a lot of sense. So he actually says, the deity assumes a hostile persona, that of the storm god. Storm gods of the ancient Near East in the persona of the biblical god, see, for example, Nahum 1:3, entail the role of the warrior. Thunder is a battle cry, lightning bolts are arrows, and so forth. So he just doesn't even bother. I mean, Alter at least says, the word's a little different. That's not what Greenstein does. Greenstein just says, yeah, windstorm, I'm fine with that. Let's move on. His first footnote comes with bind up your loins like a man in that chapter, which, prepare for combat. I really should have brought the diagram that explains how one girds their loins next time. Okay. So that people can see there's actually a diagram for how you do that with a long robe to get ready for combat.
Thank you, Jeremy.